Could I have your attention, please? Everyone, please continue eating, but we're going to, in the interest of time, we're going to get the program moving along. As many of you know, I had the privilege of working with Minister Natalie Jaresko for the past 20 years, and so I have a lot of stories I could tell, but she asked me not to, so I'm going to be a little safer today. As all of you know, Natalie's one of us. She was raised here. She graduated from DePaul University. She obviously became very involved in the Ukrainian community here through her household, Ukrainian school, etc. She then went to the Kennedy School and to the State Department. And after Ukraine's independence in 1992, Bob Zoellick, learning that she was of Ukrainian heritage, spoke the language, and an economist, handed her a one-way ticket to Kyiv, and she became head of the economic section at the new U.S. Embassy. In 1995, when we first met, she joined the Western Enterprise Fund, and that basically was a U.S. government-sponsored fund to promote private business in Ukraine. And she quickly rose to the position of Chief Executive Officer. In 2006, she started Horizon Capital. I had the opportunity to participate with her in that, a Ukrainian private equity fund, and she raised over $500 million from U.S. and European investors. Now, along the way, she managed to be named the #1 Ukrainian businesswoman, I think at least 10 times. We used to kind of have a running joke in the office, and she obviously had done a fantastic job in our business and also in paying a lot of attention to what was going on in Ukraine generally. And I think that's what led President Poroshenko to ask her to become Minister of Finance last year. And I personally believe it's the most difficult role of its kind in the world today. In 9 months, she has implemented almost everything the International Monetary Fund required for Ukraine to get the dollars that they've already received and the dollars yet to come. And that has all been obviously critical to their well-being and survival. The most significant thing was the debt restructuring announced in August, but I'm sure she'll go through a variety of other things that have been done, which in many ways are equally as significant. For those of you who have read Ron Chernow's book on Alexander Hamilton, I finished that not too long ago, and I felt that there was an interesting comparison between Hamilton and Natalie. And certainly it starts with their unusual origin for the role that they played. I'm sure you all know Hamilton's origin. For him to end up to be the right person, right place, right time was an extraordinary happening for sure. And we are fortunate to have with us today an American woman who similarly, from an unusual origin, has ended up as the right person, right place, right time. Please join me in welcoming Minister Natalie Jaresko.
Well, thank you all very much for coming out today on this beautiful day. Probably best to be eating outside at a picnic and you're all indoors, but thank you. It is a true honor to come back to Chicago and speak to you today. It's great to see so many familiar faces, both from my diaspora friends and colleagues to my business colleagues and new colleagues that I hope will continue to make investments in Ukraine. I want to thank the ambassador for the opportunity today to speak to the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, which is a very unique opportunity. And I'm really moved because I'm very grateful to Chicago, and I'm very grateful to the United States. I'm grateful because Chicago and the United States welcomed my parents, who were Ukrainian immigrants escaping the evils of the Soviet Union. The United States gave them a chance to live in peace, to work, to prosper, to raise their children, to find happiness here in Chicago. And I'm grateful because the United States provided me with a real education. I went to high school here. I went to DePaul University here, and then on to Harvard. I received my moral and my ethical education here, thanks to the United States, thanks to the American people. And I learned that human dignity is one of the most important things to cherish freedom, respect for one another. And all of these things that I learned here as a child in Chicago have come in very handy in my life in Ukraine. I'm grateful because the United States also allowed me to remain very true to my origins. I could go to Ukrainian school. I could go to my Ukrainian church. I could speak my Ukrainian language with my family and my friends. And when the President and Prime Minister asked me to join the Ukrainian government in December last year, the country was facing a war on two fronts. First, the one that most of you know very well about and see in the papers is on the military front. But second, it's very important to note that we were fighting a very important war on the economic front at the same time. So not only the Russian invasion, but a very serious economic crisis in the country. I think it was clear to everyone at that time that every citizen, every person who loved their country needed to do something. You had young men going to the front and giving their lives to maintain Ukraine's sovereignty, its territorial integrity, and its European choice. I think the president didn't think as much about Horizon Capital, but he probably knew that I'd be useless at the front. Therefore, perhaps I might have some value added in another area and offered, rather than sending me to the front, to let me participate in the Ministry of Finance. The economic crisis in Ukraine that I came into was a result not of one catastrophe, not of one problem, not of one person's actions, but the result of four successive catastrophes. First, Ukraine had 74 years of communism and dysfunctional planned economic governance. Second, it was followed by 23 years of incomplete reforms, poor economic leadership, and lack of a rule of law. Third, during the last 5 years of one of the most kleptocratic regimes ever, the wealth of the country was systematically stolen to a degree that has probably never been seen before in Europe, and certainly not in the United States, on top of amassing huge amounts of new debt, which we now have to pay off. Fourth, Ukraine has suffered a devastating war that has killed more than 8,000 of our citizens, wounded more than 17,000 of our citizens, displaced more than 1.5 million people inside the country. We have 7% of our territory occupied by Russian troops, by Russian-sponsored terrorists. 20% of our economy is dysfunctional. And I think it's hard for anyone to imagine all of this at one time. Yet we battle every day for our sovereignty, for our success, in the face of these extraordinary challenges. In order to win this battle on the economic front, the Ukrainian government, the Ukrainian leadership has had and still has three priorities. Number one, to restore and ensure macroeconomic stability. Number two, to fight and eliminate corruption. And number three, to reform the country and create a friendly for business environment that will foster investment and economic growth. So first, on the macroeconomic stability side, I've spent the bulk of my last 10 months focused on this very important building block. Restoring and ensuring macroeconomic stability was an urgent priority when I came to government. The hryvnia, our national currency, had depreciated, at some point lost 70% of its value. On one day, it went between 20 and 40, and that volatility, as you can imagine, for the average citizen, for any business, is impossible. The central bank in March had 1 month's foreign currency reserves remaining, 1 month of critical reserves. And we were on the brink of a financial meltdown, all the while fighting a war to protect our territorial integrity. And there can be no prosperity. There can be no safety. You cannot pay for your military if you do not have macroeconomic stability. It is an absolute precondition, and restoring that stability has been our number one priority. We have managed to put the house back in order, I'm very proud to say, and we have restored a modicum of this macroeconomic stability thanks to 7 measures. First, we reduced the expenses of the state. I've implemented a very strict budgetary discipline. My colleagues in government know me as Minister No. My children, luckily, had a button at home because I was Mama No before, that when you press it, it says no, and I've used it even in negotiations with the IMF. It's not easy to be the one to say no all the time, but the country has no other option. Second, we started to improve tax collection. We got rid of a variety of loopholes. There are still many to tackle, but some of them allowed many vested interests, the so-called oligarchs, to avoid paying taxes, to transfer their profits abroad. And by eliminating these, we at least stop the flow of money going out of the country and hopefully increase revenues to the state, reducing the budget deficit further. Third, our central bank has cleaned up the banking sector, a banking sector that was overbanked with 180 banks, of which at least 50 have been taken out of the sector already because they were illiquid, they were insolvent. The reasons are many: poor management, a massive devaluation, investments in the East and in the South, which have been completely destroyed, but also because of a great deal of related party transactions and fraud. Removing these 50 make those that remain much safer for the average citizens to put their deposits. Fifth, we have strictly followed, as Jeff mentioned, and implemented our IMF agreements. Since the revolution in February 14, or since April of 14, we have been consistently inside and operating fully within the IMF programs. We received just this year 2 tranches already of $6.7 billion, which in essence has brought our reserves up from what I said were critical all-time lows to over $12 billion. It's not the safe zone yet, but it's much better than it was in March. Starting September 22nd, we'll have the next review of our IMF mission. They'll be looking to see whether we're continuing along this path or not. But we expect that we will successfully receive the 5th tranche in this period of time and continue to build our reserves. Sixth, we managed to secure an important amount of financial support from the United States, from Canada, the European Union, other partners of ours, Germany, Poland, Japan, the EBRD, the EIB. It was very important that we received the loan guarantees that we did from the United States, and on behalf of the Ukrainian people, I thank the American taxpayers for that. It would not have been possible without the very quick and effective work on the part of the United States government to get us through these very difficult times. The United States has also been critically important in maintaining sanctions against the aggressor. The United States has also been very important to us in the G7 and in supporting our coalition, both against the aggressor country, but also in support of Ukraine. Lastly, we successfully are restructuring our debt, and that's probably something that's taken a great deal of my time. We reached an agreement with our ad hoc committee for an agreement that gives us a 20% haircut or a 20% debt reduction, about $3.6 billion that we will never have to pay interest on, and we will never have to pay the principal. We also agreed on a 4-year postponement of our payments. It gave us breathing space over the next 4 years, where we will not have to pay $11.5 billion of principal payments, and we can instead use what little resources we have, what scarce and valuable resources we have, for the best of the country. Thanks to these measures, and thanks to the support of the Ukrainian parliament, we have a colleague of mine from the parliament here today, and I thank him for his support. We received a constitutional majority approving that debt restructuring last week. I can only tell you that we have a very vibrant democracy in Ukraine, a very fragmented democracy in Ukraine, and therefore to receive 307 or 309 votes, I have to be honest with you, I thought it was a miracle. And I'm very appreciative that what Ukrainians have shown, what the Ukrainian political leadership has shown, is that they can come united and be united when it's critical for the country's existence, when it's critical for the country's continued success. It doesn't matter what side of the aisle, as they say here, they were on, they voted in favor. And so I'm very grateful. Thank you, Mr. Skripnik. The second major economic priority of our government is to fight corruption. When I first came to Ukraine, people would ask where I was from, and I would say Chicago, and they would say, oh, Al Capone, boom, boom. Now they all laugh because now I say that. When they say, what do you think about corruption? I say, I'm from Chicago, Al Capone, boom, boom. The Yanukovych regime was completely kleptocratic, and they stole anything they could. But it would be a mistake to say that corruption began with Mr. Yanukovych, or that it only concerned a few people in the highest echelons of power. Over the years, and this is from the communist period through independence, corruption has infected a large part of Ukrainian society, and hundreds of thousands of people benefit from this corruption. Even more so, suffer as a result of this corruption. And that's why eliminating corruption is so absolutely essential. But at the same time, as you can imagine, it's extraordinarily difficult. We have a 3-pronged strategy to fight corruption. Number 1, eliminate existing large corrupt schemes. Number 2, try to prevent the creation of new schemes. Ukrainians are extraordinarily entrepreneurial. Number 3, identify, persecute, judge, punish, or in other words, put behind bars criminals. On the first, Ukrainian legislation has been developed to allow for proliferation of large corruption schemes in the past, and we started to close them down systematically. I'll give you just a couple examples. Until this past year, oligarchs were able to, because there was no transfer pricing policy, no transfer pricing legislation, move their profits abroad to offshore locations where the taxation was much lower, and it was completely legal. And this year, it doesn't show up in our revenues because this year commodity prices are globally low. But during those years when commodity prices were very high, they paid no taxes in Ukraine. They pushed all of the profits out. We've stopped that with transfer pricing policy and legislation that is on an international standard. It is a tax evasion that should never have been allowed. Another area where we lost billions of dollars each year was in fictitious and fraudulent VAT, value-added tax. You don't have that in the United States. European, instead of a sales tax, it's a European tax. They would create fictitious, fraudulent VAT refund requests. The fictitious VAT refunds were refunded, and those legal taxpayers who had to have refunds, of course there was never enough money to refund them. So we have arrears of the past because we provided refunds to people who didn't deserve them. We've closed that with a new electronic VAT filing system, which no longer allows for anyone to get a refund if the proper documents haven't been already implemented and installed in the system. We're already seeing, just since it came live in July, revenues of $1.5 billion, 2 billion hryvnia additional per month. So we're starting to crack down on the fictitious VAT refunds. In the energy sector, probably one of the most corrupt sectors of the economy for a variety of reasons, we've gotten rid of all of the gas trade intermediaries that stole billions and billions of dollars over the last 23 years of our history. We no longer have any intermediaries between the purchaser and the seller of gas, whether it be Gazprom selling it to us or whether it's the reverse flow that we buy now from Europe more and more. We have also slashed state financing to the historic black box of our state oil and gas monopoly, Naftagaz. Last year, the state financed that black box state monopoly in the amount of about $10.5 billion. The deficit that we financed of that state oil and gas monopoly was larger than the entire government state deficit. This year, we're financing it only $1.5 billion, and we've moved all the subsidies from that black box directly to the people of Ukraine when we had to increase prices for energy. And the people of Ukraine are receiving those subsidies instead of the black box. Eliminating that corrupt scheme is very, very important, not only from a financial standpoint, where I stand in my ministry, but it's also important because it helps us to become more energy efficient. When people know the price of gas, they use less of it. It also helps us to stop rent-seeking activity. You had businesses illegally buying so-called residential cheaper gas. It also eliminates for us, to a large extent, the amount, the volumes that we were buying. We were tied at the hip to one supplier. That supplier was from the aggressor country, Russia. We are now very diversified. We have no more than 60% coming from Russia. We buy 40% from Europe. And interestingly enough, the price is lower. Even though it's Russian gas that transited through Ukraine, we buy it at the other border from those who purchased it. It's cheaper for us to buy it from Slovakia than it is to buy it from Russia. So we've broken that monopoly, and I think that's also very important. There's a wide variety of permits and other things that have to be and are being slashed in order to ensure that the average businessman no longer has to shell out every time he needs a license. But I think one of the things that's most visible to the average citizen is the new police. We finally have been rolling out from city to city, starting in Kiev, moving on to Lviv, Odessa, and others throughout the nation, a new traffic police. It doesn't sound like much here, but you take for granted in the United States, or we all took for granted in the United States, that the concept that the police serve and protect. The police in Ukraine, the traffic police, did not serve and protect before. They took bribes. If they stopped you, they stopped you to take a kickback. Now the new police have reached a completely different ethical level. They have a different set of salaries. They have a different set of morals. They're brand new hired, and they don't do that anymore. And when they do that, they're fired. It provides the average citizen in Ukraine something that they haven't had probably in 100 years, which is government service. Government service that serves the interests of the people. And so I think it's one of the very first things that Ukrainians can count on and can say that they got after the revolution. It's very important. How do we prevent the creation of new schemes? Well, new legislation is one of them. Again, I have to thank my colleagues in the parliament. We've introduced new electronic systems for purchasing. Purchasing in the state purchasing is a typical place for inefficiency and corruption. The Parliament adopted last week, in fact, a new procurement law. We've already rolled out an electronic procurement system, thanks in some part to Western NIS Enterprise Fund, called Prozora. We are already doing purchases on a transparent electronic base in the government, the Ministry of Defense, the Ministry of Transportation, everyone, saving billions of dollars a year. All public procurement will become electronic after the adoption of this law in Parliament. At my own ministry, we just unveiled a new e-data system. We just put, as of September 15th, all of the transactions of our Treasury online. There's no more hiding. If someone draws down money, it's completely in the open. As of September 15th, it was the Treasury. As of November 15th, all expenditures of all budget organizations will be online. Again, you take it for granted because that's normal here, but this has all been secret in the past. It's all been information that couldn't be accessed by the average citizen or by civil society in the past. As of next year, we'll have all of the revenue side of the budget online as well. These are institutional changes that stay whether I'm there or someone else is there, and that's very important because we don't want to make this dependent on individuals. Being able to track public funding ensures that corruption and inefficiency will be reduced. The final piece, identifying and persecuting criminals, is the part where we need to continue to do the most amount of work. I think the Ukrainian people want to see social justice. They want to see people behind bars. They want to know that the system has changed forever and that those who are put behind bars are not put because they're in the opposition necessarily, or because they left the coalition necessarily, or because they're in the coalition, whatever the political reason, but because they broke the law, simply, and that everyone should be treated the same in that respect. We've established a new National Anti-Corruption Bureau, and they have just recently selected 70 of the best qualified detectives. 25 took office last week. Again, all new people. One of my colleagues in a recent film at a conference said, sometimes you can't fix some of the things that are wrong in our country. Sometimes you just have to kill it and start over. The National Anti-Corruption Bureau is that. It's not fixing the General Prosecutor's Office, which we'll continue to try and fix, but it's something new, clean, fully funded at Western salary levels, with fully new approaches to hiring on a very transparent basis, new people to affect this anti-corruption policy. The reforms in the judiciary and law enforcement are what we need to continue working on the most. The legislative base is there now. Now it's up to all of us to implement. It's up to us to hire the new detectives, to hire the new prosecutors, which the process just started locally throughout the country, and it's up to us to ensure that they actually start prosecuting criminals. Obviously, much more remains to be done to fully eliminate corruption, but I think this is a systematic approach that will result in success if we keep demanding it, pushing it, and insisting on it. I know that Ukrainian civil society will not stop that demand. Lastly, how do we create a business-friendly environment? Well, right now, assuming we have the stability, the key issues for us are deregulation, making this less burdensome for business. It's tax reform, one of my areas for the next 3 months, my focus, reducing the burden both of taxes, actual payroll taxes on business, but also reducing the burden of paperwork, reducing the subjectivity of the tax authorities, reducing the ability to use the taxes to get bribes and kickbacks. The Minister of Economy, the Minister of Agriculture, myself, the Minister of Infrastructure, all of us came from business. So we understand in different ways, but we all have a feeling for what we went through over the last 20 years in business. And so we understand what business wants. We also listen to business. I spent 6 months on this tax reform, holding open platforms and debates and listening to every segment, IT industry, pharmaceutical industry, tobacco industry. That doesn't mean that I'm going to actually always propose what they would like. I'm not going to reduce excise duties on tobacco tomorrow. But it means that we're hearing them and we're trying to find a dialogue and trying to both keep them in our economy, attract more investment into the economy, but also have a reasonable fiscal situation. On deregulation, I can tell you that we are systematically cutting down the number of permits, licenses, authorizations. Most recently, I'd highlight the deregulation in the seaports. Ports are incredibly important for Ukraine. Number one, we're a major transit country, east, west, north, south. But number two, transit is critical for our agriculture sector, and we are one of the top 4 agricultural producers in the world, depending on the product, the commodity. Making sure that our ports function, I see colleagues here who are very involved in agriculture, and function in a less corrupt fashion and function in a more efficient fashion is critical for us to boost the output and leave more of the money not in the hands of the corrupt officials at the port, but instead in business to reinvest in agriculture. That reform has moved very quickly. Just as an example, the average time of arrival or departure of a vessel is now 16 minutes. compared to several hours earlier. Deregulation in agriculture, in addition, aside from infrastructure, we eliminated a variety of permits that were necessary to transport grains from region to region. 14 permits, 6 licenses, estimated to save business $5 billion in that chain of activity. I've already talked a lot about justice reform. I've talked about tax reform. Again, for tax, I'll just outline that from my perspective, the key is to help increase investment, increase economic growth and employment, but also to contribute to fairness, a level playing field, transparency, and solidarity. There's no reason why only the average citizen working in a factory ought to be paying his taxes, and those who are wealthy enough to choose their form of their legal form or choose where they live are able to avoid taxes entirely. And finally, tax collection has to improve public services. People have to believe that in return for paying their taxes, they're getting something, whether it's better roads, whether it's the new police, whether it's better quality education, we have a public education system, or whether it's better public health. But the average citizen needs to know that when he's investing in the government's investing back in him. I don't want to bore you, so I'm trying to think through this. Leave more time for questions and answers. I guess I'll leave you just with a couple thoughts. First, I know the news is always negative about Ukraine. And from one perspective, it's my challenge today to tell you, to make sure that you remember that Russia has absolutely unfairly, illegally, against all international principles and norms, attacked an innocent country. At the same time, I want you to remember that that is 7% of our territory. And on 93% of my country, everyone goes to work every day, their children go to school every day. Products are made, services are made, they're purchased, they're sold. We're one of the largest exporters of agricultural commodities. The country continues to exist and prosper. We're coming out of a very deep hole, but there's no reason that we should focus only on the war. I don't want you to forget about the war, but I don't want you to focus only on the war. The leadership of the country has a very clear plan to return and restore Ukraine's prosperity and return Ukraine to growth. Next year is the goal. This plan is not something that came from the sky. It was championed and approved by our largest creditors, the International Monetary Fund, the United States government, the European Union. It means that we're on the right path. And it means that we enjoy more support today than we probably have in 23 years. Second, I want to assure you that as a government, we are walking the walk, not just talking the talk. It's very simple to just pass laws and do nothing. But these laws are being implemented. Much more needs to be done. The task is Herculean, literally. I don't think another country has ever had to deal with all of these things at the same time. But we are committed and we're determined to do what it takes. And lastly, none of this would have been possible without the United States, without the U.S. taxpayers. And I want to thank you with all my heart. I'm confident that without you, we would never have come this far. But I'm also confident that with you, we will continue on this path and we will succeed. Ukraine deserves the United States' support. The Ukrainian people have worked hard to prove their mettle. And so I ask you to continue supporting Ukraine. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for those wonderful remarks. It's now time for questions. So if you have one, please raise your hand. We'll get a microphone over to you. Please introduce yourself first, if you could, before you ask your question. Who has the first question? Anyone? Oh, let's go right over here to start with, then we'll come back over here. Yep, right over here.
Hi, my name is Huilin Wang. I'm from China. Thank you very much for your speech. Thank you for directing Ukraine to the right direction. So I have a question about your anti-corruption campaign, because corruption is like one of the biggest challenges for the majority of, if not all of the developing countries. So I feel that like corruptions are like from the top to the bottom, and corrupted people are connected. So my question is, what kind of challenges or pushbacks you face, or you will expect when you try to implement those anti-corruption campaigns, and how will you deal with those?
I think the issue is very much what you said, which is it's a network. It's a very complicated networking of corruption, and it's very hard to kill it all at once. The most obvious thing that I see in my efforts is when vested interests try to block things in the parliament. So if I am looking to increase, as I said, for example, let's just say the royalties on ammonium transit through the country, the arguments are populist arguments, you know, that I'm trying to kill business by increasing those duties, or that I'm being unfair to the ammonium industry. But the fact of the matter is, standing behind those arguments is often the vested interests that are able to, not unlike in the United States, frankly speaking. You know, the United States Congress has a lot of vested interests standing behind their shoulders as well. I think in Ukraine the problem is it's not as transparent as it is in you know, because you have public financing. What I will say is that the Ukrainian parliament is currently reviewing legislation on, for example, political party financing, and I'm very much in favor of doing it, but I'm only in favor of doing it if we publicly finance political parties entirely. I don't think it should be a mixed system where we provide public financing and then, you know, we have all the corrupt money anyway. So if we're going to get rid of that and we're going to have complete public financing, that might help us to at least be more transparent. So the vested interests work very, very hard to maintain their privileges in society, and it is hard. But I think more and more Ukrainian parliamentarians, more and more of our political leadership at every level understands that the Ukrainian people have zero patience left for all of this. The Ukrainian people did not stand at the Maidan, did not give their lives at the Maidan, are not giving their lives every day at the Eastern Front. And luckily last night we had no deaths because the ceasefire is holding. But for, you know, the last year and a half, it hasn't been that peaceful. They're not giving their lives in order to maintain the status quo. They are giving their lives, and the choice was, again, it was never fully understood perhaps, but they didn't give their lives for a European trade agreement. The trade agreement was a symbol. The trade agreement was a symbol of a European set of values: freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom to develop your life, your children's lives in a way that, you know, you all in the United States or in other countries have become well accustomed to. And civil society, although it's fragmented, is extremely strong in Ukraine. No comparison to the neighbor next door to the north. That civil society won't allow for us to take much more time. So I think vested interests are obviously interested in maintaining their receipts, let's call it. But I think we will continue to work with the political leadership, both in the parliament and with the president and the prime minister, to keep trying to force them down.
Great. We had another question over here. Yeah, right in front of you, Paige.
Natalie, first of all, I'd like to thank you for doing what you're doing. Have been there with you for the last 20 years. Although I am sort of retired, I am watching it very closely, as you know, to see whether my friends are right about getting involved again. One area that 10 years ago, sitting around a table with former Ambassador Taylor and former Minister of Justice Varich, I said the same thing. I said, I'm from Chicago, and we had Operation Greylord, where 11 or so judges were put in jail. And I watched it through the papers. I even sort of, from law school, knew some of these people, or knew of these people. One area that I am watching very closely, because I got involved at the end of my career, is judicial corruption. I personally fought, or took on a fight, towards the end of the Yanukovych regime with number 1 and number 2. And they're still judges. They're still in the system. Tachkov and Emelianov, whose 13 million were found somewhere in Liechtenstein, is still a judge. Why has judicial reform been at least as it's visible, so slow, and maybe there are some secrets coming up, meaning things that are in the process, but I always thought that judicial corruption is the biggest cancer of, and why the people of Ukraine have not enjoyed the wealth of Ukraine. Because, as you know, simple thing, when a bank had its collateral, it wasn't the bank's collateral, it was not the debtor's collateral, it was the judge's collateral. And it was just a competition as to who pays more. Could you comment on that?
Sure. I can't agree more that judicial reform is absolutely critical. And without it, we cannot succeed. It has started. It is too slow. Why hasn't it gone faster? You know, I think there are probably a variety of answers. I'll try and stick to the non-political ones. Number one is that no one seems to be willing right now to just fire everyone and start over. That would be the cleanest and the easiest, I gotta be honest with you. It's the same, and I take responsibility in customs. Fixing the corruption in customs, fixing the corruption in the courts requires literally nothing more than firing everybody and starting over, which we did with the local traffic police. It doesn't mean that the old ones can't reapply, but the standards are so different that most of them can't get through the bar, don't reach it. With the courts, there's a lot of excuses given that, you know, it would disturb the situation too much. Who would we hire? We could have a lot fewer courts, for example, in my opinion. We don't need as many courts as we have. I think there are many ways to apolitically fire people. In other words, we could take every decision, for example, made by the European Court of Human Rights against a Ukrainian case. Wherever they've ruled against a Ukrainian judge's decision, that judge ought to be removed. It's apolitical. Not his friend, not your friend, not your friend. Who cares whose friend he was? You decided, and your case was overruled by the European Court for Human Rights, you're out. That hasn't been done. There have been cases where the parliament has removed the immunity of judges for them to be prosecuted. But again, the weakness of the prosecutorial system and the weakness of the courts in which they're being judged by their colleagues is a continued problem. And so this, whether you clean it, how do you clean it up how do you clean it up in a slow fashion? I'm not sure how easy that will be. People have suggested, for example, for business, bringing in a third country. You know, just let London do all of the judgments for anything in business. But there's the balance of, you know, we're a country of 45 million people. We really shouldn't be giving our courts over to another country. I have people criticizing me for my willingness to outsource customs to a private player, because we shouldn't be doing that if we're a country of this great stature. And that argument's true, but I would look for faster reforms if at all possible. Part of it is constitutional, and it's in the process. I believe that this constitutional decisions are right now focusing also on the elimination of immunity for the judges and so on. Immunity is an important part of it. You can't go and ask the parliament every time we want to have somebody's immunity removed for a judge. But it is the most difficult part of this. The prosecutorial side is actually changing more rapidly, which at least means that we are already seeing, you know, probably more arrests for corruption in the last year than in the past 23. But arrests don't turn into prosecutions unless the courts agree. And so courts are consistently letting people out on bail. There's a law right now in the parliament, a draft law, for large corruption cases to not allow people to be allowed out on bail. You know, people who are corrupt have plenty of money to make bail. It's the opposite. You know, I mean, of course they can make bail, and then they, of course, leave the country. So bail is not an answer for corruption. You should sit in jail and, you know, have a quick, efficient process. You can't. We also have the human rights issues that every Western government comes to us if we do anything on too quick a basis. Then they say, you know, human rights, and you've got to maintain, you know, democracy. You can't, you know, abuse the judicial system. So there's a constant balance. But I am certain that we will be doing this more quickly, because I am certain that there's, again, very little patience for this to continue ad infinitum.
All right, we have about 15 minutes left. We'll go hear from Mr. Simpson, and then we'll come over here next. There's a mic coming.
My name is Lou Simpson. I would like to understand and help us understand the energy situation in Ukraine. What percentage is the Ukraine self-sufficient? And I know there has been relationships with Russia and Gazprom, and now you're trying to change that. But where does this go over the next 3 to 5 years in terms of sourcing energy?
If take the question and limit it to natural gas for a moment. The goal of the country is to become self-sufficient in 5 to 10 years. We have a possibility to do that if we can change our royalty system right now and encourage domestic investment in our own natural gas, number one. Number two, if we continue the tariff reform, bringing prices to market prices, which we've committed to do over the next 2 years, then we will be increasing efficiency because people will be using less by the very nature. And three, we've already continued to open up as many of the reverse flows from Europe as possible. We continue to work on increasing the capacity of the reverse flow, for example, from Slovakia, so that we don't have to buy as much from Russia. Today, we import, of the imported portion of our gas, we import about 40-50% from Russia. And the only reason we have to do that is because we can't import enough through the one interconnector in Slovakia at the time that we need it. And that's almost also not even an energy issue, it's also a financial issue. Had we had the money to buy and store gas in our underground storage tanks, Ukraine has the largest capacity of underground storage tanks in all of Europe. Had we had the money earlier this year to purchase and store it, we wouldn't be in a position where we had to depend on an interconnector and now we have to buy from Russia. We didn't have the money at the time. I think we've changed that with some new loan agreements that are revolving facilities, so hopefully we won't be facing that again next year. But the goal is certainly decrease. We have been in the past the most energy inefficient country in all of Europe. So decrease the inefficiency, increase the domestic investment, and then move as much away from and diversify as much away from Russian gas as possible. It is certainly physically, if you look at the numbers in terms of the natural resources, the wealth of the country, it is possible.
What are you paying for Russian gas?
Right now, they're negotiating, and the negotiations are now trilateral because we can't seem to do it on a bilateral basis, so the European Union is involved. Of course, the European Union's interests are in ensuring that the transit of gas flows freely through the winter months. The pricing is gone down because commodity prices have gone down, so we're in the 240, 260, depends on, I don't know where the new contract will be, but it's a more reasonable price. The Russians talk about discounts, but you need to ignore that. It's not a discount, it's a market price. It's a discount from the idiotic prices that they charged us, $440 per 1,000 cubic meters a couple of years ago, but that's because when they charged those prices, the intermediary that was getting a kickback, was based on those prices. And so there was a reason for all of that, and it was part of the corruption over the last 23 years. The Russians weren't giving kickbacks to intermediaries from a low price. They were giving it from a very high price.
Sir, you still have a question? Please.
Hello, Natalie. Reason I'm being personal is because I married your mother. Anyway, this will be short. Can you explain in your own words the decentralization of the government in Ukraine? Because they aren't accustomed to it like we are. Our states here govern ourselves. In Ukraine, it's a little different. They depend on the central government more. Maybe you can focus on Donbass.
Absolutely. First thing is that, yes, we had a very centralized system, one that we inherited from the Soviet Union. The first decentralization has already occurred, and that has been fiscal, and I was very happy to be part of that process. We have pushed down the ability to tax certain property taxes and other taxes at the local level. They get to determine who and how much they want to tax, not unlike what you have here. It gives them the ability not only to have authority, but also to a large extent for them to start taking responsibility. There is an interesting debate. People don't really want to tax. They don't want to. They want Kyiv to figure it out and Kyiv to be blamed, and then they just want to beg for the money. So the decentralization has been very successful. In fact, there's 40% more on average after 6 months in terms of budget revenues locally than there were the previous year. It was a great surprise for local authorities, and I think they're now, if we didn't have local elections, it would probably be a much easier situation. But once we get past the local elections in October, I think the fiscal decentralization has been very successful. There's still some kinks to work out where you have poorer areas that need to be subsidized, and there's a subsidy element in the budget for those very poor areas, in particular mountainous regions that don't have revenue generation capacity. We'll have to give them a subsidy and work with them, but that was thought about in advance. The fiscal decentralization starts to give them not only, again, authority, but then responsibility. The idea being, who knows better than a local community whether or not the money needs to be put into a kindergarten or a road or a school. For Kyiv to be making those decisions is inefficient. It breeds corruption because everyone comes knocking on the door begging for money. And of course, when you beg, that's what happens. But it's also just better decision making. The second part of decentralization has come up more recently, and that's more about government at the beyond fiscal. That's the constitutional debate. It was a very difficult debate. My colleague here knows how difficult it was. As part of the Minsk Agreements that were agreed between Ukraine with the support of Germany, France, and signed onto by the Russian government, the Ukrainian authorities have agreed to ensure some decentralization throughout the country, but including that part of the country, Donbass. It is the first time in Ukrainian history where a president has actually agreed to devolve his power down. And the model for decentralization that we've taken is not the American one, but the Polish one. And we're modeling it on Poland. The first reading, or the first of two readings, it was adopted, the changes were adopted, but they're still going through a process of national dialogue, and there's still enormous differences of opinion as to whether or not any set of decentralization should have any special rules for Eastern Ukraine. And the position of the government is that there are no special rules for Eastern Ukraine. There will be no special rules to come out of this crisis. The rules are very clear. The Minsk Agreement is very clear. Number one, remove foreign troops and equipment from our country. Number two, close the border and let us control our border once again. You can't imagine, but I mean, we had a border with no border. We trusted our brothers from the north until the tanks started rolling over. Second is the border. Third is we agree to local elections, but local elections under Ukrainian law. And once we have local elections under Ukrainian law, then we can have a dialogue about everything else. But as you can well imagine, and it's probably President Reagan, we don't talk to terrorists, right? So we need local elections. We need people who've been elected by the people in that part of the country to choose their own leadership under local elections under Ukrainian law with international observers that meet fair and free standards of the international community, with OSCE observers present. And then we can talk about all the other things that come from there. But I'll be very frank with you, it's a very long and very difficult process, and I think we're not quite there yet. The decentralization more generally will continue moving forward because the Ukrainian state really does need to decentralize. But the special status issues, I think, are much more complicated, and I don't think there are many in Ukraine. I don't believe even the administration believes that they ought to have any special status above and beyond what is reasonably possible and what's reasonable under the Ukrainian constitution.
We have time for just one or two more. Yep, right next door.
Wait. Natalie, I wanted to know, what is the Minsk agreement doing now? It seems to be at a standstill. The war is going on. The boys are going to freeze this winter and die. And I wanted to know exactly what is the plan. I mean, it seems to be we're not talking with the Russians. What is happening?
So I have to say I disagree completely with my mother. So, number one. And it's not the first time either in my 50 years. Number one, the Minsk Agreement is working. We can like it, we can dislike it, but I just said to you, no one died last night. We've had only 12 deaths since the ceasefire began. And every day that we avoid death, every day we avoid someone being killed in our country is a good day. So number one, only through diplomacy can we achieve this. We cannot physically win a war on our own against the largest standing army in Europe, a nuclear power. So the Minsk Agreements are critical to keep the dialogue going. The other thing that the Minsk Agreements have been very successful at, besides the ceasefire today, which although it's fragile, I have to say every day is a good day when nobody dies. The second part of it is about the release and exchange of prisoners. We have already released 2,882 Ukrainians imprisoned by these terrorists in the country. We still have several hundred to release, and we still have 11 of our citizens being held in Russia under made-up, trumped-up charges. From the very famous case of Nadya Savchenko, one of our air pilots, to the case of Mr. Sentsov and Mr. Kolchenko? Kolchenko. People who literally only voiced their opinion that they thought the annexation of illegal was Crimea. So the exchange of prisoners is very important. But if I were to say the one single most important thing above and beyond the lives of our citizens that is the Minsk Agreement has done, it has given us the broad international coalition to keep this from getting worse. We cannot do it on our own without the European Union, without Germany, without France, without the United States support, without the United States, without the European Union sanctions against Russia. I don't know where we'd be. I would not be here. I would be there for sure. I wouldn't be able to travel. We would be in a situation so much worse that you can't imagine. The soldiers will not be cold. We have funded our war efforts in full and beyond in full. We are spending 5% of our GDP on the military and on our law enforcement in country. I cannot tell you how much that is for my country. It's a lot of money. It's 100 billion hryvnia. It's $20 billion. This money that we don't have, but we are spending it on our $2 billion, $2 billion. Money that is very valuable to the country, but we are putting it to good use. Is it as efficient as it could be? No. Is there corruption? Of course there's corruption everywhere. But the boys have all new uniforms. They are all well prepared for winter. We have not started a new round of mobilization. The ceasefire has given us the ability to start demobilizing instead of doing a full new mobilization. That's a blessing for every mother, for every wife that doesn't get that telegram in the mail. Americans have a hard time understanding because every war that you've lived through has been very far away. Vietnam was on TV, Afghanistan was on TV, Iraq was on TV. This is at home, in your backyard, and you know people who are being called up to duty, you know people who are dying on duty, you know people who've come back traumatized from duty. Your children, my children are growing up, and you know this, my children are growing up, they volunteer at rehabilitation hospitals, they make bracelets for the soldiers, they make cards. It's a completely different mentality when it's in your backyard. And no one more than Ukraine wants peace. No one more than Ukraine wants the end of this. But it has to start with removing foreign troops, foreign equipment from our soil. It has to start with closing the border and allowing us to control what comes over that border onto our soil. And it has to be done in a diplomatic fashion. Ukraine has successfully stopped and deterred the aggressor. Can you imagine? Think back, if you will, for just a moment to February of 2014. The Russian forces were able to take Crimea without a blink. We watched it on TV. They would have cameras and they would just literally take over military facilities and people would just walked away. We had no military a year and a half ago. The military had been completely destroyed by years of inefficiency, years of no investment, years of selling the best equipment. Ukraine is a major arms exporter, and yet we had no arms. We sold all the best stuff to somebody else and kept the stuff that couldn't be put to use. We have rebuilt our military from scratch. The best, most patriotic, most least selfish members of our society have gone to serve at the front. None of this could have been imaginable a year and a half ago. And I think we need to take it all into context. We've successfully stopped them from going any further with the support, not alone, with the support of the international coalition that the Minsk Agreements allows us to have. And so I think, there are lots of people who will criticize the Minsk Agreements, lots of people who will criticize my restructuring, my debt restructuring agreement. I understand that. But as a person who negotiated, I didn't negotiate Minsk, but I negotiated the international debt restructuring, I know that I couldn't get anything better. I know what leverage I had, what I didn't have. I knew who was on our side, who wasn't. I watched the creditors walk out of the room when I tried to get 2% more. They took their bags and they left me without saying goodbye. They got on their planes. So I know I hit a wall, and I'm sure our president has done everything he can to negotiate the best deal he could in the environment that we all live in. And I think the most important thing is just implementing every single part of it. Thank you.
We have time for just one more. We can go right over here.
My name is Patty Motzke, and Natalie, thank you so much. It's such a pleasure. And all that's been accomplished in a short period of time is just absolutely incredible. I think a lot of American citizens would like to do something to help. What would be the most I know some of them have wanted to send money because there have been drives for these soldiers. You say the soldiers are adequately funded right now. I mean, what could the average American citizen do, if anything?
There's quite a bit. I'll start with the most political, which is I recommend you call the White House, your senators, and your congresspeople every day, and you leave a short message about your support for Ukraine and that the Ukrainian people deserve continued U.S. support in the area of defensive equipment, military equipment, humanitarian aid, and financial aid. Those phone calls mean more than anything. They count them, they log them. It's extraordinarily critical. If you spent 5 to 10 minutes a day making 3 to 4 phone calls a day, and I mean every day, everybody makes 3 phone calls. We would have much more effect than we would have with anything else. Set that aside for a moment. There are enormous humanitarian needs. I described to you the devastation of this war, and this devastation that I've described to you is what we know. We don't even know inside the occupied territory of Donbass how much has been ruined, how many thousands of apartment buildings, thousands of kindergartens, thousands of orphanages. We don't even know what's happened to the very poor elderly there who can't leave their homes to escape. We have 1.5 million internally displaced people. People are talking about migrants, 10,000 migrants, 20,000 migrants in European countries from Syria. And I understand their pain because we are dealing with a humanitarian catastrophe of unknown sorts. 1.5 million people we've had to move from Crimea and from the east, resettle them, rehouse them, put their children in schools, find them jobs in the middle of a recession. Not to mention the trauma of picking up and leaving your home, leaving everything you know, leaving everything, with one bag in your hand. So I understand Europeans and the issue of migrants because we have 1.5 million of internal migrants. So anything that helps with the humanitarian cause is extraordinarily valuable, and there are a variety of organizations from the International Red Cross to Caritas to local American organizations. There are lists of them, and I'd be happy to share with you. The consulate will probably have them as well on the humanitarian side. But many of you are business people, and so what I ask you to do, see, this is an answer that has no end. What I ask you to do is to come back to Ukraine with a clean and fresh set of eyes. Set aside for a moment the past. I'm not saying you should forget it, and I'm not saying that it's gone away, but come with a clean and fresh set of eyes and see where you might be able to add value through investment, through trade. In the end, that's the best thing that anyone can do for Ukraine. We're not in the business of asking for humanitarian aid. That's not really what we're interested in. What we're interested in is real economic growth in partnership with all of you, with the businesses that you represent, with the businesses that you know. I had a wonderful meeting this morning with ADM. ADM invested an additional $18 million just recently in sunflower oil capacity. He told me 3 things that were critical. 1, he's extraordinarily proud of his Ukrainian team. He is very happy that he doesn't have expatriates, that he has Ukrainians who are committed fully. War, no war, they're not running to their embassies and leaving the country, and how that's been so important for his business. He employs 900 people in Ukraine. 2, he said the war had no effect on his business whatsoever. I asked him to say that to the press. And 3, he's willing to do more. He sees the potential and he sees the ability to do more. And I think it's a very good example. We had a Japanese firm unfreeze a business proposal a week ago for the manufacture of wire harnesses in Lviv Oblast. That'll create probably 3,000 jobs. 3,000 jobs. I mean, it doesn't sound like much here, but 3,000 jobs is a lot of jobs, especially in Western Ukraine, which is not very industrial. So every single one of these projects, every single investment is critical for our economy. And so those 3 areas are what I would suggest, from the political to the humanitarian and finally to the business side.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's all the time that we have. Please join me in thanking Minister Jaresko for her comments today.